The wilderness is unforgiving, but few dangers compare to a grizzly bear on the hunt. A single misstep, wrong place, wrong time, can turn a peaceful hike into a fight for survival. When instinct clashes with brute force, survival depends on one thing: making the right move before it's too late. The scent of sweat and fear hangs in the air as the massive predator locks eyes with its prey. Every heartbeat pounds like a drumroll of fate. In that moment, hesitation is the enemy. Only swift action can tip the balance between life and death. In the vast, untamed wilderness of British Columbia, the year 1987 was just another harsh season for the men working in the logging industry. The dense forests stretched for miles, their towering pines and thick underbrush concealing creatures that lurked unseen. Among the men at the remote logging camp, Frank Delaney had built a reputation as a seasoned and level-headed worker. With over 15 years in the business, he had encountered his fair share of dangers, from unstable trees to unpredictable weather, but nothing had prepared him for what was about to happen. The camp itself was a collection of makeshift cabins and equipment sheds, sitting in a clearing that had been hacked out of the surrounding forest. The nearest town was hours away by truck, making the place feel even more isolated. Supplies were brought in every few weeks, and the men lived in relative discomfort, battling the elements and the ever-present exhaustion that came with their grueling work. The only real comfort was the communal mess hall, where hot meals and coffee were the only rewards after a long day. Life in the camp followed a brutal routine. The workday began at sunrise, with men rolling out of their bunks, their bodies sore from the previous day's labor. The morning air was crisp, sometimes bitingly cold, depending on the season. Breakfast was a hurried affair: eggs, bacon, thick slabs of bread, and then it was out into the woods. The sound of chainsaws buzzing filled the air by mid-morning, along with the rhythmic crash of falling trees. Men worked in teams, strategically cutting timber and loading it onto transport trucks that would navigate the perilous dirt roads back to civilization. Frank had been working on sharpening his chainsaw near the tool shed that morning. The other loggers were scattered throughout the site, some hauling equipment, others taking a rare moment of rest. The air was filled with the familiar sounds of saws and distant shouts. The scent of cooking lingered in the air, wafting from the mess hall where breakfast had been prepared earlier. The attack came without warning. A massive grizzly bear, drawn in by the scent of food and emboldened by hunger, stormed into the camp. The creature was a towering mass of muscle and fur, easily over 800 pounds, its shaggy coat dusted with mud and leaves. It moved with terrifying speed, knocking over a stack of wooden crates as it made its way toward the camp's center. Shouts erupted from the workers as they scrambled for cover, some retreating into the cabins, others sprinting toward vehicles in hopes of getting inside before the bear spotted them. The sudden explosion of chaos sent tools flying and coffee mugs shattering on the ground. A few of the newer men, unfamiliar with how to handle such an emergency, froze in place, their faces drained of color. But Frank had no such option. He had been too far from shelter when the chaos began, and now he was directly in the beast's path. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized the only thing between him and the grizzly was the running chainsaw in his hands. He had no gun, no knife, no chance of outrunning something that could close the distance in seconds. The bear let out a deep guttural growl, its huge head swinging toward him. Frank barely had time to react before it lunged. Instinct took over. With a desperate swing, he brought the chainsaw up, the whirring teeth meeting thick fur and flesh. A deafening roar filled the air, followed by the sickening sound of the saw tearing into muscle. Blood sprayed as the grizzly recoiled, its enormous body twitching in agony. Frank staggered back, gripping the chainsaw so tightly his knuckles went white. The fight lasted mere seconds, but to Frank it felt like an eternity. The bear thrashed violently, its powerful limbs smashing into the ground, kicking up dirt and debris. The noise was deafening, a mix of mechanical whirring, animalistic growls, and the panicked shouts of men who could only watch in horror. Frank had to act fast. The chainsaw had cut deep, but the bear was still alive, still dangerous. As it tried to rise, he swung again, this time aiming for the creature's throat. The second strike was the one that ended it. The beast collapsed within seconds, its weight shaking the ground. A stunned silence followed, broken only by the distant sound of someone shouting Frank's name. The other loggers emerged cautiously, eyes wide with disbelief. One of them, a man named Darrell, approached slowly, rifle in hand, but it was clear the weapon was no longer needed. The grizzly was dead. Frank stood there, breathing heavily, his hands trembling as he let the chainsaw drop to the ground. The reality of what had just happened sank in. He had fought off a grizzly bear with nothing but a chainsaw, and somehow he was still alive. Later, the men gathered to assess the damage. The mess hall's outer wall had deep claw marks, and several supplies had been destroyed. The mess hall's entrance was splintered where the bear had tried to force its way in before changing direction. Several pieces of equipment had been overturned in the panic, and a few men had minor injuries from tripping over debris as they ran for cover. But none of that mattered. Frank's survival overshadowed everything else. Some of the loggers called it a miracle, others just shook their heads in awe. Frank himself didn't see it as anything but sheer, blind luck. As the adrenaline wore off, the weight of the event settled over him. He replayed it in his mind over and over, each detail sharper than the last. The smell of blood in the air, the way the saw had vibrated in his grip, the sheer power of the grizzly as it lunged. He knew that if he had hesitated even for a fraction of a second, things would have ended differently. That night, as the camp settled into an uneasy calm, Frank sat by the fire, staring into the flames. He knew one thing for certain. He would never look at the wilderness the same way again. The forest had always been dangerous, but now it felt personal, and though he never spoke much about that day, the men who had witnessed it never forgot. The story of the logger who killed a grizzly with a chainsaw became legend, passed down in hushed tones among those who worked in the remote woods of British Columbia. In the years that followed, Frank continued logging, but something had changed in him. He took fewer risks, stayed closer to the group, and never left his cabin without a weapon nearby. He understood now what true terror felt like, what it meant to face death head-on. And while he had survived, he carried the weight of that day with him for the rest of his life. In the heart of Everwood National Park, deep in its vast backcountry, the year 1995 brought one of the harshest winters in recent memory. The park's rugged landscape, dominated by thick forests and sprawling meadows, was blanketed in snow, cutting off many of the less traveled paths. Only the most experienced rangers were tasked with maintaining the isolated outposts used for wildlife monitoring and emergency rescues. One such ranger was David Callahan. David had spent nearly a decade working in Everwood, familiar with its unpredictable weather and its equally unpredictable wildlife. At 6'2", with a frame built from years of hiking through rough terrain, he was as tough as they came. He had always prided himself on being prepared for any situation, but nothing could have readied him for what happened in February of that year. He had been assigned to repair an old ranger station nestled deep within the park's northern range. The station, built decades earlier, was barely more than a glorified shed, a single-room structure with a wood stove, a cot, and a storage cabinet for supplies. It was used mostly for emergencies, a shelter in case of sudden storms or injuries far from the main stations. His task was simple: reinforce the structure, check its inventory, and report any damage that would need future repairs. He arrived early in the morning, parking his snowmobile a few hundred yards away and trekking the rest of the distance on foot. The snow was deep, crunching beneath his boots with each step. The air was bitterly cold, his breath hanging in thick clouds before disappearing into the stillness. The shed stood exactly as he had left it last fall, weathered, leaning slightly to one side, but still intact. By mid-afternoon, David had completed most of his work. He reinforced the door hinges, patched a section of the roof that had caved slightly under the weight of the snow, and restocked the emergency supplies. Just as he was about to pack up and leave, he heard a deafening crash outside. His pulse quickened. Stepping cautiously toward the window, he peered out and felt his stomach drop. A colossal grizzly bear, easily one of the largest he had ever seen, was rummaging through the snow-covered remnants of an old food storage container. The wind must have carried the scent of past rations, luring the beast out of its winter lethargy. Most bears were still in their dens this time of year, but hunger could override nature's plans. David knew better than to make any sudden movements. Slowly, he backed away from the window and reached for the emergency cabinet. His rifle was back on the snowmobile, completely out of reach, but he had a flare gun, standard issue for any ranger station. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it might be enough to scare the bear away. Then he heard the sound he had been dreading. The bear had moved to the shed's entrance, sniffing at the door, its huge paws scraping against the wood. The flimsy structure wasn't designed to withstand a determined grizzly. If it wanted in, it would get in. A heavy blow shook the entire shed, knocking a few supplies off the shelves. David braced himself, gripping the flare gun tightly. Another hit, then another. The door frame groaned under the strain. He had only seconds to act. As the bear's claws tore through the upper section of the door, David aimed the flare gun directly at the gaping hole and pulled the trigger. The flare erupted in a blinding flash of red and orange, streaking straight into the bear's face. A terrifying roar echoed through the valley as the animal stumbled back, shaking its head wildly. The flare had ignited a patch of fur, and the beast reared up on its hind legs, thrashing violently. The intense heat from the flare gun had also ignited a propane canister stored just outside the shed, and in an instant, flames erupted. David didn't hesitate. He kicked the weakened door open and bolted outside, sprinting through the knee-deep snow toward his snowmobile. The bear, still engulfed in patches of fire, let out another anguished roar before crashing into the underbrush, disappearing into the forest. Panting, David reached his snowmobile and fired up the engine. He sped away, the adrenaline still surging through his veins. It wasn't until he reached the main ranger station nearly an hour later that he realized how close he had come to death. The next morning, a team of rangers went to investigate. They found the charred remains of the grizzly a few hundred yards from the shed. The attack had been a rare and desperate act of hunger, something none of them had expected so deep into winter. David never worked alone in the backcountry again. The incident became park legend, a chilling reminder of the unpredictable dangers lurking in Everwood's wilderness. Even in the weeks following the attack, David struggled to shake the experience. At night, he would wake in a cold sweat, replaying the moment the bear's claws had torn through the shed's wooden door. The sound haunted him. The deep guttural snarl of a starving predator, the crack of splintering wood, the rush of wind as he sprinted for his life. It wasn't just the fear of the bear itself that unsettled him. It was the realization of how utterly alone he had been in that moment. Survival in the wilderness often depended on preparation, but no amount of training had prepared him for being trapped in a flimsy structure with an enraged grizzly. The incident changed how he approached his job. Where he once felt invincible, confident in his ability to handle any situation, he now carried a persistent unease whenever he ventured into the park's remote areas. His fellow rangers teased him at first, calling him Firestarter or Hotshot. They told and retold the story to every newcomer, embellishing details until the tale sounded like something out of a horror movie. Some said the bear had been the size of a truck. Others claimed David had barely made it out before the entire shed exploded behind him. David never bothered to correct them. He let them believe whatever made the story more exciting, because deep down he knew the truth was terrifying enough. The small Siberian village of Srednyaya, nestled deep in the Russian taiga, had always lived under the unspoken rule of nature. Winters were brutal, summers short, and survival depended on preparation and sheer resilience. By 2008, the village had dwindled in population, with only a handful of families choosing to remain. Among them was Yuri Petrov, the village butcher, a man whose skill with a blade and deep understanding of animal carcasses made him invaluable to his neighbors. Yuri was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, hardened by years of working in sub-zero temperatures. He ran the village's only butcher shop, a small wooden structure that doubled as a storage house for meat. The back room held hanging carcasses, frozen stiff in the unheated space, while the front displayed freshly cut portions for the few customers that still came by. His days were routine, predictable, until the night everything changed. That winter had been particularly harsh. Snowdrifts buried the village roads, cutting them off from the nearest town. The usual supply trucks hadn't arrived in over a month, and food was running scarce. Wild animals, too, were feeling the strain of the long winter. Reports of wolves venturing into human settlements had increased, but what concerned the villagers most were the bears. Some, too desperate to hibernate, were still roaming, searching for any scrap of food they could find. Yuri had heard the stories from hunters passing through. A particularly large grizzly had been sighted several times near the outskirts of the village. The animal had raided storage sheds, overturned sleds, and even killed a few stray dogs. It was starving, and that made it unpredictable. Still, no one expected it to come so close to the village center. On a late evening in February, Yuri was finishing up his work. The shop was empty, save for the carcasses hanging from the steel hooks in the back. He had just finished locking up the front door when he heard a sound, a deep, low rumbling. At first he dismissed it as the wind howling through the trees, but then the noise came again, closer this time. A heavy thud rattled the wooden walls. Yuri grabbed his lantern and stepped toward the back room. That's when the front window shattered. Shards of glass rained down as the huge head of a grizzly bear forced its way through. Yuri barely had time to react before the beast let out a deafening roar, its hunger driving it mad. The smell of raw meat had lured it straight to the shop. Without thinking, Yuri bolted for the nearest weapon, a cattle bolt pistol used for slaughtering livestock. It was designed to kill cows with a precise shot to the skull, but against a fully grown bear, he wasn't sure it would be enough. The bear was inside now, its enormous body knocking over wooden counters and shelves. Its breath came in thick, steaming clouds as it sniffed out the hanging meat. The bear's eyes locked onto him. It was no longer searching for scraps. It had found something else, a meal. Yuri knew that if he hesitated for even a moment, he wouldn't make it out alive. He pressed his back against the wall, gripping the cattle bolt pistol so tightly his knuckles turned white. The bear lumbered forward, its paws thudding heavily against the wooden floor, each step vibrating through the walls. It sniffed the air, its nostrils flaring, and let out another low growl, this one directed at Yuri. He had no choice. As the bear lunged, he ducked to the side, barely avoiding the enormous swipe of its claws. Splinters flew as the creature's paw struck the counter instead, sending knives and tools clattering to the ground. Yuri took his chance. He lunged forward, pressing the pistol directly against the creature's forehead and pulling the trigger. The steel bolt shot out with a mechanical hiss, striking the bear but failing to penetrate deep enough. The beast let out a furious roar, staggering back, its massive paws swiping blindly. Dazed but not defeated, the grizzly turned, its survival instincts taking over. With a final snarl, it barreled through the wreckage, shoving past the broken door and vanishing into the snowy darkness. The butcher shop was wrecked. Blood pooled on the floor, mixing with shards of glass and splintered wood. Yuri stood there, breathing heavily, the pistol still clutched in his hands. He knew he had just escaped death by mere seconds. By morning, the entire village had gathered outside his shop, staring at the wreckage and the deep claw marks gouged into the wooden walls. The event quickly became legend, and though the villagers hailed Yuri as a hero, he never entered his shop unarmed again. But the effects of that night didn't wear off easily. Over the following weeks, Yuri found himself waking in the middle of the night, haunted by the image of the bear's dark eyes locking onto his. He could still hear the sound of its claws raking across the wooden floor, still feel the tremors of its mighty body smashing through the shop. He had killed countless animals in his lifetime, but this had been different. This hadn't been livestock or game. This had been a force of nature, something ancient and terrifying. Word of the attack spread beyond Srednyaya. Hunters and trappers from nearby villages came to hear the story for themselves, offering their own theories as to why the bear had wandered so deep into human territory. Some said it had been sick, others claimed it had been an omen, a warning that the balance between man and nature was shifting. The old men of the village nodded solemnly, muttering about harder winters to come. Yuri didn't care for theories. He had lived through it, and that was enough. He spent the next few weeks repairing his shop, replacing the broken window with reinforced boards, and installing a steel lock on the door. But no amount of repairs could erase the memory of that night. The butcher remained wary for the rest of the winter. Every evening, as the sun dipped behind the frozen treetops, he would double-check the locks, keep his rifle within arm's reach, and listen carefully to the sounds outside. He no longer ignored the distant howls of wolves or the occasional snapping of twigs beyond the shop's walls. The wilderness had reminded him of a truth he had always known but never fully grasped. Out here, survival was never guaranteed. The Alaskan wilderness was no place for the unprepared. In 2012, the vast, untamed expanse stretched endlessly, its forests thick and rivers freezing. Mike Sanderson and Eric Glover had spent years hunting these lands, their skills sharpened by countless trips into the backcountry. Experienced outdoorsmen, they knew the dangers, the cold, the isolation, and most of all, the wildlife. They had set up camp near a remote river, their small tent nestled between towering evergreens. Their rifles were leaned against a nearby log, their gear neatly stacked. The trip had been a successful one so far, with both men securing enough game to make the harsh trek worth it. They had spent the evening skinning and preparing their kills, carefully preserving the meat for the journey home. The fire crackled as they sat by its warmth, telling old hunting stories and enjoying the rare solitude of the backcountry. But neither of them was prepared for what happened on the third night. The attack came suddenly. It started with a rustling sound outside the tent, subtle at first, almost like the wind stirring the leaves. Both men were light sleepers, accustomed to the usual noises of the forest, but this was different. It was deliberate, heavy. Then came the breathing, deep, guttural, and unmistakably close. It was the sound of something enormous, something predatory. Eric had barely unzipped the tent when a large grizzly bear barreled through their camp, scattering supplies and overturning their cooler. The smell of their food had drawn it in, and now the beast was in a frenzy, driven by hunger and instinct. The cooler shattered under its powerful claws, food spilling into the dirt. The bear let out a guttural snarl, snapping its jaws at the air as it searched for more. The bear's size was staggering, a towering behemoth of muscle and fur, its thick coat matted from the wilderness. Its claws, each longer than a man's fingers, glistened in the firelight. It moved with terrifying speed, tearing through their supplies with ease. The men scrambled, reaching for their rifles, but in the confusion, they had been knocked out of reach, lost somewhere in the chaos. Mike acted on instinct. He grabbed his .500 Magnum revolver, a gun many considered excessive for hunting. But as the bear turned its gigantic head toward him, its dark eyes locking onto his, he knew it was their only chance. Eric was still fumbling in the dark, trying to grab a knife or anything to defend himself, but there was no time. Mike aimed at the beast's skull and fired. The first shot rang out, deafening in the still night. The bullet struck true, sending the bear reeling, but it did not fall. It let out a monstrous roar, shaking the very trees around them. Blood dripped from its wound, but the pain only seemed to enrage it further. It turned back toward Mike, its vast frame blocking out the fire's glow. He fired again. This time the bear staggered, its body twisting as it let out a sound somewhere between a growl and a howl. But still it didn't go down. The third shot brought the animal crashing to the ground. The impact shook the earth beneath them, sending a cloud of dust and snow into the air. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by their ragged breaths. It took several moments before they could move, before they could comprehend what had just happened. Eric finally managed to find his rifle, but by then it was already over. His hands were shaking as he turned to Mike, his breath coming in short gasps. The fire flickered weakly behind them, casting long shadows over the wreckage of their camp. Their supplies were destroyed, their food scattered, but they were alive. When rangers arrived the next morning, they confirmed what the men already suspected. The bear was one of the largest ever recorded in the area, a great predator driven by desperation. Its teeth were worn down, its ribs slightly visible beneath its thick fur, signs that it had struggled to find enough food through the harsh Alaskan winter. It had likely been near starvation when it attacked their camp. Neither man ever returned to that part of Alaska. The trip had been a success, but the memory of that night never left them. The wilderness was unforgiving, and they had come closer than ever to becoming prey instead of hunters. In the weeks following the attack, Mike found himself replaying the moment over and over in his head. He had always respected the wild, understood its dangers, but this had been different. It wasn't just about the bear, it was about how easily the roles could have been reversed. They had gone from hunters to the hunted in a matter of seconds. Eric, too, struggled with the memory. He had always prided himself on his quick reflexes, his ability to stay calm under pressure. But that night, he had hesitated. He had fumbled while Mike had acted. It wasn't something he liked to dwell on, but it lingered at the back of his mind every time he held a rifle. The story spread among the local hunting communities, becoming something of a legend. Some exaggerated the details, claiming the bear had been the size of a small car or that it had taken 5 shots to bring it down. Others questioned why they had been so unprepared, why their weapons hadn't been within reach. But those who had spent enough time in the wilderness knew the truth. No matter how prepared you were, sometimes nature had its own plans. For Mike and Eric, the experience changed them. They continued to hunt and explore, but they never went into the wild without a backup plan again. The .500 Magnum became a staple of their gear, no longer considered overkill, and every time they sat around a fire in the middle of nowhere, listening to the sounds of the forest, they remembered the night they had come face to face with something truly wild. The Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia is one of the last true wildernesses on Earth. In 1991, its rugged landscape was home to active volcanoes, icy rivers teeming with fish, and an abundance of wildlife, including the formidable Kamchatka brown bear. It was a land of extremes where survival depended on knowledge, preparation, and respect for nature's unforgiving ways. Ivan Fedorov was no stranger to this wilderness. A seasoned fisherman in his late 40s, he had spent much of his life navigating the region's frigid waters, setting traps and hauling in salmon. He knew the dangers well: freezing temperatures, unpredictable currents, and of course, the bears. But he had never before come so close to death as he did on that fateful morning. He had set out before dawn, paddling his small wooden boat along the river's edge, his breath turning to mist in the cold air. The fishing had been good, and by mid-morning he had nearly filled his crate with fresh salmon. The river was calm. The only sounds the gentle lapping of water against his boat and the occasional cry of an eagle soaring overhead. Then, the uneasy feeling settled in, a prickling at the back of his neck, the sensation of being watched. Ivan had spent enough time in the wild to trust his instincts. Slowly he turned his head toward the shore. An enormous grizzly stood at the river's edge, watching him intently. Its fur was thick and matted, its body leaner than it should have been. A hungry bear, and it was far too close. Ivan knew he was in trouble. His rifle was in the boat, but out of reach. Moving too quickly might provoke the bear. He had only seconds to decide his next move. His hands hovered over his fishing knife, but he knew that wouldn't be enough. Then his eyes landed on two items within reach: his bear spray and a single signal flare. The bear made its decision first. It stepped into the river, moving toward him with a slow but deliberate pace, its deep-set eyes locked onto him. Ivan had seen bears fish before, but this one wasn't interested in salmon. It was interested in him. Acting on instinct, he grabbed the bear spray and unleashed it as the beast lunged into the water. The effect was immediate. The bear let out a bellowing roar, shaking its massive head as the irritant burned its eyes and nose, but it wasn't enough to deter it completely. Without hesitating, Ivan reached for the flare gun, aimed directly at the bear's head, and fired. The flare struck just above its snout, igniting a patch of its fur in a burst of red and orange. The bear recoiled, letting out a monstrous howl before thrashing toward the riverbank, its massive paws churning up water and mud. Blinded and panicked, it stumbled into the thick underbrush and disappeared. Ivan sat frozen, his heart hammering in his chest. It took several minutes before he found the strength to start paddling again, his hands trembling as he gripped the oars. He didn't stop until he was miles downstream, far from where the encounter had taken place. The next morning, rangers found signs of the bear's struggle, but no body. Deep claw marks scarred the trees where it had crashed through, and traces of burnt fur clung to the riverbank. It had survived, but just barely. Ivan never fished alone after that. The wilderness had tested him, and though he had survived, he knew better than to tempt fate twice. In the weeks that followed, Ivan struggled to shake the memory of that day. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see the bear's face inches from his own, its breath hot, its jaws wide enough to snap him in half. The adrenaline had carried him through the moment, but now, in the quiet of the nights that followed, his hands still trembled when he thought of how close he had come to death. News of the encounter spread quickly among the local fishermen and hunters. Some dismissed it as exaggerated talk, while others nodded knowingly, having had their own close encounters with the region's predators. The rangers who tracked the bear confirmed its desperate condition: starving, weakened, willing to take risks that a well-fed bear never would. Despite the reassurances from others, Ivan found himself changed by the experience. He had always been confident in the wild, but now every rustling in the bushes, every splash along the river's edge sent his pulse racing. He reinforced his boat, ensuring his rifle was always within arm's reach. He carried extra flares and extra bear spray, and most importantly, he never went out alone again. Though he continued fishing, the thrill had diminished. He had spent decades on these waters, but now each trip carried a weight of unease. The Kamchatka wilderness had always been a place of beauty and danger, but now the danger felt personal. He had looked death in the eye and survived, but just barely. Years later, sitting by a fire with other fishermen, Ivan would occasionally recount the story, his voice steady but distant, and every time, without fail, he would end with the same warning: the river gives, but it also takes. Always be ready. The rolling plains of Montana had always been home to Henry Whitaker. In 1977, he ran a small cattle farm on the outskirts of a quiet town, where the nearest neighbor was miles away. Life was simple but hard. Days were spent tending to the animals, repairing fences, and preparing for the harsh winters that could make or break a rancher. Henry was a man of few words, built like the land he worked, weathered, strong, and unshakable. He had seen wolves before, even lost a few calves to them, but bears were a different story. Grizzlies roamed the forests and sometimes ventured into ranchland, but attacks were rare. He never thought one would come storming into his barn. It happened late one evening as Henry was finishing up his work. The cattle were restless, their low, anxious sounds carrying through the cool autumn air. He figured a coyote was skulking nearby, looking for an easy meal, but then came the crash, a deafening explosion of splintering wood and panicked bellows. Rushing to the barn, he threw open the doors and was met with chaos. A huge grizzly, easily over 800 pounds, had forced its way inside. The animal had already taken down one of his steers, blood staining the dirt floor. The other cattle panicked, trampling over themselves to get away. Henry had no gun on him. His rifle was in the house, too far to reach. His only weapon was the nail gun he had been using to repair a broken stall door. It wasn't meant for this. It was for wood, not an apex predator, but he had no choice. As the bear turned toward him, its mouth still dripping red, Henry raised the nail gun and fired. The first nail struck its snout, causing it to let out a furious roar. He fired again, aiming for its eyes, its face, anything that would hurt. The bear thrashed, blinded and in agony, colliding with a support beam before collapsing. The fight was over in seconds, but Henry stood frozen, the nail gun still clenched in his shaking hands. The barn reeked of blood and sweat, the cattle still frantic. The grizzly twitched once, then lay still. Word spread fast. Neighbors came to see the aftermath, shaking their heads in disbelief. Wildlife officials confirmed the bear's death, calling it a freak encounter. Henry never spoke much about it. He simply rebuilt the barn, patched up the damage, and kept the nail gun loaded from then on. But the encounter stayed with him. Every time he stepped into the barn at night, he would hesitate for just a moment, listening, waiting. The wind howling through the trees outside sounded different now, like a warning. He had never been a man to scare easily, but there was something about staring down a grizzly with nothing but a nail gun that changed a man. In the weeks following the attack, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that the bear had been desperate. The drought that summer had made food scarce, forcing animals closer to human settlements. He had heard rumors from other ranchers, sightings of hungry bears, claw marks on cabin doors, livestock vanishing without a trace. The thought unsettled him. It meant this might not be the last time it happened. His routine changed. He reinforced the barn doors, added extra lighting around the property, and made sure his rifle was always within reach. He had always been a practical man, but now he was a cautious one too. His dog, a scrappy mutt named Roscoe, had always been a good early warning system, but now Henry let him sleep closer to the house. Any sign of movement in the fields, any strange sound in the night, and Henry was up, checking the perimeter with a flashlight and a rifle in hand. The local wildlife officials told him the bear's behavior had been unusual. Most grizzlies avoided direct encounters with humans unless provoked, but hunger made animals bold. Henry knew that better than most. Over the following months, he continued his work, but something had shifted in him. The land he had lived on his entire life suddenly felt less predictable. Every time he stepped into the barn, the image of the bear, wild-eyed and bloodied, flashed in his mind. He had faced danger before, but never like that. Never something so raw, so immediate. As winter set in, Henry prepared as he always did. He stocked up on supplies, ensured his cattle were in good health, and double-checked every lock and fence. But the memory of that night stayed with him. The Montana wilderness was unpredictable. Henry had always known that, but now, every time he heard the wind rustling through the trees at night, he wondered if something bigger was out there, watching, waiting. Years later, the story of Henry and the nail gun would become a legend among the locals. Some embellished the details, saying he had taken down the bear with a single shot, others claiming he had stared the beast down before pulling the trigger. Henry never corrected them. He simply went on with his life, quieter than before, always prepared, always listening.